the original concept of volume of oxygen, or that mammals consume oxygen, is the difference between the room air oxygen. When it goes into the mammal and comes back out, you eat some of it, and that's called oxygen consumption. And the oxygen is either at the mitochondria, which is inside the muscle, so your heart doesn't, it pumps it to the whatever you're doing. And inside the muscle says, I have oxygen coming here, and I've got fuels, carbohydrates, or fat. I'm going to eat the oxygen to stay alive. So we can do VO2 at rest and simply call it a VO2 test. We can do it on an active person. As they increase work, we can say they're going to eat more oxygen because they're doing more work. The great thing, that the simple finding that make everything should make sense, is that oxygen consumption, which again would be calories per minute, goes up linear with work.
Welcome back to the program. I'm your host, Scott Fulton. I've been wanting to do a program on VO2 Max for some time, and it occurred to me really the only program that I could possibly have was to bring my good friend Dan Zeman in to share some thoughts with you. Dan is a pioneer in VO2 Max, which is, in our world, a cardiopulmonary exercise test. We're going to talk about what is a lab test versus what's that VO2 Max that's on your smartwatch, and what's that telling you, and how do those two compare. Dan's got some stories to share with some of the professionals that he's worked with over the years. And ultimately, it's really about, so why should VO2 Max matter to anybody? I'm not an athlete, or I am. That has very different meanings, probably depending where you are, but ultimately it's a pretty important metric, and we're going to really dive into more of why Dan thinks that's important as we look forward into aging. So I think you're going to enjoy this conversation. It's relaxed. We kid around a little bit, and hopefully you'll find some really valuable insights for you here. Welcome to the Healthspan podcast, my good old friend Dan Zeman. This is a treat, because you and I have had, I don't know how many conversations about this, and we've never threatened to do this. And I had the idea of asking you if you would have this conversation with me, and we'd tape it, and you were kind enough to say yes. So I'm sorry, this is gonna open up the world, the kind of things we talk about. So welcome, Dan.
Yeah. So again, this is about harmonica or country music, or what is it about? I forgot. I know whenever you call me, it's always about, yes, that's what, right. We're going to talk about lung function with harmonica players. That's what it is, right? I think.
Yeah, because and not our friend, your friend Willie Nelson. He would love some of this lung function at this point, I'm sure. So.
Well, it's interesting about COPD. Again, one of the things that we have in common, and so for the listener, you and I both share a passion for the aging process. We both share a passion for longevity. And all of those are involved with lung function, heart function. So how do we keep people physically active? How do we keep them emotionally stable? And how do we keep them cognitively alert? And so that's our core. And yet when we see these old people who are kind of iconic, that have found a purpose, who are still doing something, you kind of go, we got to look at them. We got to observe these people, because our generation, man, my wife and I were out for a walk yesterday, and she's turning 73. And I was like, did I know that? And then I'm going, don't say that, but it already came out. And I said, what's interesting is, when I was a teenager, when my 70-year-old great uncles came, you were like, put a bib on that guy.
Yeah.
That dude is like, I'm sorry, but I don't want to be around that guy. That guy is ancient. He's got to be dead. And now you and I are sitting here going, I think we got another 20 years left. And I'm going, wow, what a timeline we've been able to live in. So thus the passion about longevity is why I respect you. Okay. I mean, knowledge is one thing, but that's why I respect you.
Well, I think we talked a little bit before we got going here, because we can't help ourselves. We also came up through the world of measurement from this idea of, well, wouldn't it be interesting if we could measure whatever in all sorts of fields, right? So anyone who's been in that field has seen tremendous change. And so we're going to talk about in terms of cardio fitness, but in terms of VO2 specifically, just the changes in something like that. So part of, for the listener, is Dan, you really are at the early days of really kind of seeing this come to fruition with not at that day one, but in terms of seeing a big change over the decades, while most are relatively new to VO2.
Yeah, and I think that's what's disappointing is when I hear someone say something that they don't have the depth of knowledge to understand what they just said was wrong. Yeah. And again, I was so disappointed, and this is in 92 or 94. Again, those are like, people go, 94, I wasn't born. I go, well, just hear me. So in 94, when we looked at oxygen consumptions, so breath by breath possible, we couldn't do that in the 80s, on an athlete, on his form of training. So for example, with Lamond, we was with him from 89.
Okay, hang on. We got to remember there's other people who don't know when you say Lamond who that is. Okay, so sorry, I'm going to have to do this a few times, but don't worry.
Okay. Well, again, I'm with you. So here's the interesting thing is one of the great PhD MDs from South Africa. We're at this ACSM conference. It was a world conference, and I was looking at why professional athletes, in Greg's case, would have a decrease in CO2.
Okay, I'll interrupt. Greg LeMond, first American to win the Tour de France.
Yeah. Won in 86, 89, 90. Yeah. But so we started doing it. And Greg was the first one that said, hey, I need to find a guy. And he said, I'll look at your stuff. And he said, well, and I said, okay, well, we're going to put you on a bike. And I want you to bring your bike in. And so I measured him on his road bike with his clips, with his seat height. So again, he wants to get better doing that. So anyway, we go through this presentation, and in 94, this guy comes up and says, I was kind of disappointed that you didn't put Greg on a treadmill. And I just looked at this guy who I thought was one of the pioneers, said, I can't believe you asked a stupid question like that. But I didn't. I wanted to. I really wanted to, because I'm going, I don't think that protocol of a treadmill test where you walk slow up a big hill is a relative test for a guy who's riding a bike at 80 or 90 RPMs up Alpe d'Huez. So he was so disappointed that he thought I was dumb because I didn't follow the norm of, at the time, everybody who did a VO2 max test did a treadmill test. It was a 3-minute stages. It was a slow walk up a big hill, and that's what it was. And I'm going, I think you should be a little more open to the idea that athletes get paid to ride a bike. And so I shared with you yesterday about what I showed the guy was a study we did on wheelchair athletes. And trust me, it was all I could do. So with Tammy, she'd won the Grandma's Marathon. It was based on Minneapolis, and she won Twin Cities. So she's in a wheelchair, obviously. And so I didn't put her on a treadmill. And I wanted to know if the guy actually got the idea that I put her on the treadmill, or I let her use her rollers with her racing gear because she only wanted to get better at that. And I'm sure in his mind, he said, well, she can't walk. That's why you didn't do a treadmill. And I'm going, you're still not understanding how stupid you are. And so the medical world always looked at oxygen consumption scores or calories per minute with the K rations in the beginning. But the idea of the fitness movement coming in the 90s that said, hey, these guys want to know more about training effects. What do they train? Who needs a VO2 max? Why are they important? And what sports benefit from them? But you will know the same thing when you switch to cycling or when you switch to swimming. You want to find out what the biggest limitation in your ability to go fast. So if a swimmer, I don't see them doing a lot of steady state cardiovascular. I see them spend a lot of time with their stroke mechanics. So we don't do VO2 max testing on swimmers because they don't swim. We don't do VO2 max testing on 100-meter runners because they run 100 meters. But the high-end cardiovascular athlete, just like the aging man or woman who's over 50, is losing max heart rate, is metabolically challenged, and is gaining weight. All three of those things, a valid VO2 test is relative because it can show training effects. And again, that came from the sports world, not from the medical world, because the medical world says, I don't see any EKG problems, you're fine.
Okay, let's back up now.
Okay, go ahead.
And we'll bring a few folks up to speed, and maybe just kind of go back and say, let's talk about what is the VO2 max test from, and hang on, don't jump in yet, from the context of what is the real test versus what is it when we have it on a smartwatch.
Okay.
And then let's talk about that. And then so folks know what's coming, we'll talk about, so what's the value of a VO2 number in terms of what's the value to you as an individual of having a solid or a good VO2 versus a low VO2. So let's talk about in the pure sense of what is the VO2 max test. And I like to use maybe you, but a lot of folks know the stress test for their cardiologist may send them in for a stress test.
Right.
Maybe that sometimes is a baseline for comparison. Usually it's going to be a treadmill, but okay. So
right.
With that set up, let's talk about what is a VO2 max test.
All right. So the original concept of volume of oxygen, or that mammals consume oxygen, is the difference between the room air oxygen when it goes into the mammal and comes back out. You eat some of it, and that's called oxygen consumption. And the oxygen is either at the mitochondria, which inside the muscle, so your heart doesn't, it pumps it to the whatever you're doing. And inside the muscle says, I have oxygen coming here, and I've got fuels, carbohydrates, or fat. I'm going to eat the oxygen to stay alive. So we can do VO2 at rest and simply call it a VO2 test. We can do it on an active person. As they increase work, we can say they're going to eat more oxygen because they're doing more work. The great thing, that the simple finding that make should make sense, is that oxygen consumption, which again would be calories per minute, goes up linear with work if the workload is linear. So when you say a treadmill test, the protocol needs to be increasing linear at a time. So in other words, strength test, 5 pounds, 10 pounds, 15 pounds, 20, 25, 30. So it's linear, it goes up. Then your heart rate goes up linear, your oxygen consumption goes up linear. And you can see then test, retest, is your heart rate lower at the same workload than last year? And you go, well, how did they get lower? You say, well, you're better at consuming oxygen. Your heart rate goes lower because you have more blood delivering. So it is complicated, but there's really two tests. One is using VO2 to look at calories per minute, and then looking VO2 in a stress test to compare the fitness changes or what has changed across time. The most important thing in that is to use the protocol or the type of device, the exercise piece, treadmill, bike, elliptical, that the person is most familiar with, because the training effect that you bring in across the year is done at the muscle of what you're familiar with. So Greg LeMond, Tour de France winner, would be terrible on a treadmill relative to himself. He'd
Right.
still be in pretty good shape. But you go, well, his heart doesn't know he's on a treadmill. Heart doesn't know he's on a bike. His lungs don't know. But the skeletal muscles that are saying, feed me the oxygen, I will consume it, our cycling muscles are unique because he's been training them. He's familiar with them. So the oxygen consumption is based on the familiarity of it. And that's why most people rely on a treadmill test for John Q. Public, because they all generally walk. But again, I would never do a VO2 treadmill test on a swimmer, because those muscles don't consume oxygen because they're not familiar with it. So the short thing is, it's a test that's always been used for calories per minute in the real world. In the disease population, we had treadmill tests. We looked at EKGs and nothing in their mouth, just EKGs to look for an arrhythmia. Again, and I'm going to go off again. This is your point is twofold again. Traditional stress tests, EKG stress tests, are done on symptomatic people. What that means is 2 days ago, I was out raking the yard and I had these massive chest pain. I felt like I had an elephant on my chest. So 911 comes. Again, that came in West Virginia in 2005. So don't kid yourself. 911 in our generation wasn't like been around for the 50s. But so the guy comes in, goes to ER. They go, we think you had a heart attack. We now look at enzymes. We're going to put you on a treadmill test and see if we can find out if it's a rhythm or a blockage. So that stress test is a symptomatic test to see if we can trigger the arrhythmia and see if what's wrong with him.
So
That's
maybe
right.
while you're there, this is the time to mention what are the EKG leads doing, because they're common to both tests.
Yeah, the
Right?
EKGs there, and it's interesting. It was always kind of funny because it's a 12 lead EKG test, but there's only 10 electrodes. And you go, wait a minute. So there should only be 10 electrodes. Well, why isn't there 12? It's a 12 lead, but it's a 10. And I go, okay, just each of them have different perspectives. So where they're located gives them a different look in the heart to see what were like a three-dimensional view. Now you will find this a little humorous, I would hope. So they have a right leg and a left leg and a right arm and a left arm. If you go in and look at the EKG, if you look at the treadmill leads, it says right arm, left arm. In my early days, they were right arm and left arm, and they were right leg and left leg because you were laying there. Then they said, well, we have to have them run. So they slid them up to here and to here, as opposed to putting them on the arms because the electrodes always fell off.
Right.
So they actually had to adapt. Congratulations, the medical world figured out that when they're on the treadmill, that we might have to actually move the limb leads in so they don't trip. But those leads are, again, but that test is not about trying to see how fit the person is. They're just putting them in and they're exposing the heart to a workload, hoping that whatever caused that arrhythmia 2 days ago, they can say, yes, he has a abnormal heart, this is it, or they'll do with the cholesterol and other things and they'll look for it. Those are symptomatic tests on people who had a symptom. They're trying to find the reason for the pain, the chest pain. Now, the fitness person says, do I need all those EKG tests? And I saw yours, and I know enough to know with HIPAA, but one of the things that happens with 55 and 60-year-old people who do a stress test with the 12 electrodes on, they get what we call false positives. So you'll get an arrhythmia, what they'll call like typically a PVC, preventive ventral contraction. So when you look at these PVCs, they trigger sometimes a nervousness. You don't know them. You don't get like a flutter or whatever. So you get a lot of false positives. And in your case, the cardiologist who does that test will say, we got to do this treadmill test on because you have these false, and you'll go in with your level of fitness, and the guy will look at you and going, what are you doing in here? Well, you're the most fit guy we've ever seen in the last year. And you go, so you have to be careful that some of the arrhythmias are falsely positive. So if you go in with the 12 lead EKG and want a VO2, don't be surprised if it reveals some heart arrhythmias that go away with exercise or come back. And yes, you'll get them found out, but you'll end up going, boy, now I mentioned that because with the firefighters, if you get those with the firefighters, you have to turn them in, but then they get pulled off the truck for a month. So everyone doesn't like it. So yes, the false positive causes a lot of headaches. Now you say, well, you rule it out. And I go, well, the reality is if he was going to have chest pain, 2 days ago, he was climbing up a ladder with 50 pounds on him in a smoke-filled room. His heart handled that really well. So you're telling me 24 hours later, he's going to go, now I'm having a massive MI. So,
yeah.
So
the reason I raise it up is because I get asked frequently by age group athletes
right.
about VO2 from a medical standpoint. So, and I was one of those ones because, again, we go back to measurement. People are right. see the value of it, and that's how I actually discovered I had some blockage was through VO2 Max because it would never come up in anything else.
Right.
So in that case, that's one of the reasons I continue to do it. It's not because the number is particularly meaningful that I'm shooting for some number, but from a medical standpoint, for an age group athlete, it's often hard. If you go to a normal stress test, you're likely to pass that with flying colors because you're so fit. You're not able to actually put enough cardiac stress on, right?
It's a great point. The other thing about putting that mask on is that you can look at what we would call a threshold, anaerobic threshold, or ventilatory threshold, or lactate threshold, the three. So again, it's a threshold because everything else goes up linear. You're looking for something that goes this way and then takes a break.
Exactly.
That threshold is where something is linear and then it changes the slope. That threshold. So a lot of times, and there's a cardiologist that's out of Atlanta that's really pushing very hard for all the symptomatic people to put a mask on as well, because during that treadmill test, their threshold will be really early. as opposed to what they would expect. So it triggers, again, there's something wrong with his heart, that maybe the arrhythmia won't show up, that they would go farther. But again, what I like about that comment is twofold. The first one is, yes, it has value. But secondly, for you, is it shows the value of being fit doesn't mean that you're healthy.
Right.
So again, like you said, like Jimmy Buffett came through the Sports Center and, ends up dying of skin cancer. A very fit guy. But, the reality is there's a lot of guys who have a lot of diagnoses that are with their heart, but they don't know about it until they go get a cancer screen or something else. And they go, it's a good thing you did this, because absolute fitness is not as the powerful as predictor as people think it is. It is powered by mLs per kg, is that to have a high VO2 relative, you have to have a low body weight. So basically it shows that fat people who are sedentary have poor VO2s. Lean guys who are fit have high VO2s. So is it that they're lean and active, or is it they're overweight? So, but your point is very valid. And I think if you're going to have one, ask for a VO2 as well as the 12 lead EKG, and do that maybe every 3 years or 5 years and see. But I'm sorry, but you triggered this. So I had this conversation with, you'll know as a triathlete, the biggest bump in AFib diagnosis is in men triathletes. Mm-hmm. So atrial fibrillation. And I said to this group of cardiologists who were sitting there, and I said, I think it's the cycling. And they said, I don't care what it is. They is an AFib. We'll put them on a beta blocker. And you're going, you put these guys on beta blockers is the worst thing you can do, because now they can't get a heart rate above 130. So you just destroyed them. And they go, well, explain to me, why is there a big bump in AFib diagnosis with these 60-year-old triathletes? So you're going, well, 20 years ago, we had 60-year-old runners who didn't have a big bump in AFib. 20 years ago, we had a big bump in swimmers who didn't have a diagnosis of AFib. So the cycling allows you to do these high intervals, and you just do the work. So it's the high intervals that you can do on a bike, because you don't weigh anything. You just don't have the same power. If you're 180, you're not doing the same intervals in the track that you did when you were 150. So it does show that. So it's interesting how movement can go back to a diagnosis. And that's where, to your point, it's much more valid to look at a mask if you can get it, because it gives you another thing of what's going on inside the mammal than just walking up a hill.
Right. Okay, let's just kind of switch gears for a minute here, because I asked the question about how we compare the VO2 lab test, which I tend to call it the lab test to differentiate between it, versus, I've got my Garmin smartwatch on, which will tell me my VO2 every time I run or anytime I'm curious.
Well, it goes back to the original. And this is a nerd stuff again, and I'm sorry, but if you go back to
that's what we're here for.
If you go, thanks. If you go back to the original K ration stuff, what they found out was the term MET. They created it, MET. They call it, I'm at one metabolic rate. So they just use MET. And they found out that's how many calories if you were in K rations in the military, how much to feed them. So if they were 60 kilos, 60 times this, but there was one constant, and they used 3.5 milliliters per kilogram. So you'd say 60 times 3.5 is this many calories, 70 times 3.5 is more, 80. So, and so they came up with these MET levels. And at the time, though, all the data of all the people who were 160, 170, 180, 190, 200 were all back in the 1950s and 1960s. So they scaled linearly. Why that's important is the MET levels are how you go to calories. So today's heart watch is based on the original MET predictions of running economy. And you'd say, well, first off, like with the Timberwolves or the NBA, I spent 17 seasons with those guys. If you put a guy who is 6'10" on a treadmill at 4 miles an hour, that's a slow walk. And if you put a person who's 5'6" on the treadmill 4 miles an hour, they don't know if they should jog or walk. But that there is one algorithm on the watch for everybody's fitness level, and they assume that they're all 15% fat or 18% fat, and that's how they scale. And so when you put in the watch that you weigh more, it says, oh, he's got the 30 pounds is equally distributed in bone density, muscle density, and fat. You go, no, he's got 30 pounds fatter. And
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
so the watch has one algorithm, one equation. And so if you're represented in the original 1950s and 60s frame size, so you and I had big bones or small bones, if you remember that terminology.
Right,
that
right.
we use. So it makes a lot of assumptions. And unfortunately, if you change your weight, you may get a better score without changing your fitness level. And so that's why, when in doubt, put a mask on and measure you individually, because your own biomechanical efficiencies will come out when you run. And this is maybe the best example. I was very fortunate to, I mean, again, I've been blessed. I can't tell you how many people I've been around who are studs. So we're doing a VO2 max on a 1,500-meter woman Olympian. She wasn't a world record holder, but she had American records. So we're doing a treadmill test on her. And I'm looking at her VO2 scores, what I think would be a normal score for someone like you and I doing a 9-minute mile or an 8-minute mile or a 10-minute mile. And she is pathetic on that thing. I'm going, I thought this woman was a stud. And again, this is how stupid even you can be when you think you know something. So I'm looking at this 10-mile, I'm going, she just looks like she's running up and like a sewing machine. She's like bouncing like this. Yet as the treadmill got faster, her scores came down because now she could have the stride length that she needs when she's a 1,500 meter.
Right.
So she's no longer the bobbing sewing machine with the. You've seen these, like if you watch like barrel racers, the horses, they prance up and down and then they just bolt. So I'm looking at a 1,500-meter runner thinking she has the body mechanics of a 10-minute miler, like a 10-minute miler. And you go, you know why she runs a 1,500? Because she's not very good at the 10K.
Yeah.
Her DNA in her would be terrible on that algorithm, because she doesn't care if she runs an 8-minute mile or a 9-minute pace. No, she runs a 1,500 and she runs as fast as, probably 20 people in the world. So you go, oh, probably shouldn't use the algorithm with you and I as the norm.
Yeah, I'm asked all the time, partly because I do an annual lab test, and I'm always kind of curious what the algorithm is showing. So what I kind of try to coach people around is the absolute number is wrong in all likelihood on whatever your watch is showing, and I think it tends to have a positive bias. So it tends to overstate what people's VO2 max is, because, as a marketing tool, that's probably more favorable to your customer, right?
Yeah. And again, that's the same way with a lot of the exercise equipment that you get out and this thing says they burn 200 calories and you're going, well, they put you down without, if you don't have to enter weight, it just assumes you weigh 250. So it can say, man, I burn more calories. And another thing, here's the interesting, Scott, people always go, I really like that because I burn the most calories when I run compared to if I'm a biker. And I go, it says I burn 1,000 calories an hour. I go, machines don't burn calories, humans do. Yeah. So in your case, the test you had with 50 mLs per kg at 60 kilos, 3 liters, 15 calories a minute is max burn for you. So if you did it for an hour, which first off is that'd be 1 hour at your max level, you get, and you're going, but the machine says in fact, the original cross-country ski machine by Nordic Track, the wooden one, had to be pulled because it said you can burn 1,000 calories. Humans can burn 1,000 calories an hour cross-country skiing. And I go, no, really, really, really fit people can burn 1,000 calories.
Yeah.
It's like the treadmill says, look, on the treadmill, you can run 15 miles an hour here, if you can run 15 miles an hour. But if I can only run 4, I'm not going to get on the treadmill and say, I can do the 15 miles an hour. So marketing plays a role in a lot of that stuff, which is
yeah. But I will just kind of close that out. Is where it is seeming to be valuable is relative change. So if all else is equal, right? And that's really for people is, are you improving or not, or staying the same? That's relatively reliable. So that's the one that matters most, because the absolute matters. Well, we can switch gears maybe and talk about.
So let me continue with that, because this is exactly why a VO2 measured makes sense. Because you can look at 3 things. You can look at the relative score, mLs per kg at that workload. You can look at your pulse or your beats per minute at that workload, and you can look at whether you're burning a different percentage of fats or carbohydrates at that workload. Those across time are what you want to show a training effect. That's where you show that the human got better. If you're saying, I had the same peak I had before, as soon as you run out of max beats, you're not going to have it anymore. So you want to say, the last 3 years, through 80% of my max, my heart rate's been lower at each workload. My VO2 is, I'm becoming much more efficient and better at it. And then secondly, I burn more fats at that workload than I did before, where I used to burn a lot of carbs at that workload. Those are three valid things that say your adaptation is great. Continue to do that training program.
Right. And so maybe to that point is, you mentioned over a period of years, like 3 years, like these adaptations take time, right? We're used to, we can see some short-term ones, but I'm thinking primarily of burning fat versus carbohydrates. Like that takes time, right?
Yeah. And that's, again, it's a relative statement of how fit you were or are. So for example, a relatively unfit person, and again, as long as they're not 40% fat and above, starts a walking program, and in 6 to 8 weeks, the heart rate will drop 10 beats at the same workload that we were pre-tested on. But the mitochondria may take longer to change. But in like with Greg, you're not going to see these continual drop in heart rates on these really fit guys. They're already at 100. I mean, like I told you, when we did the scan for his heart, we thought he had a valve problem. I told the lady, that the technician, and the woman, they're very talented, don't get me wrong, it wasn't meant to be a woman or a man, it was just, that's who it was. I said, now within 1 minute, he's going to go from 190 beats to 50. And so get ready. And she was like, okay, yeah, okay. And she had never seen a human adapt that much. So to your point is, the deconditioned person is not going to recover 100 beats, or in that case, 140 beats in 60 seconds, because they haven't been doing it long enough. They could eventually adapt to that. Their heart rate will drop. But in his case, that was a training effect of years of training that allowed him to recover, which again is one of the pieces of being active. Again, it all goes back in the longevity world. The worst thing you can do is be inactive or sedentary. You'll lose all of the training effects that are beneficial to you.
Yeah, yeah. You reminded me of doing the long training exercises for Ironman and going beyond where I really was ready for, and then where you decouple, right? And then all of a sudden, the heart rate is running another 10 beats higher than it was, like doing the exact same effort 20 minutes ago. Yeah. And then the recovery is seemingly hours as opposed to minutes, right? That's that.
And again, that's one of the things we look at with the value of even looking at leaders permit with rest. It's funny with the firefighters, always the easiest one is because people say, I'm going to put a VO2 on and look at calories per minute. I'm going to have a resting metabolic rate. And so you sit them in a chair, they come in, they don't have coffee, they don't have food. Again, it's kind of like what we did with the original with sugars with A1C levels, why that's beneficial than the resting blood sugars that we have requirements for them. But so the person comes in very well rested, sits there, and literally can doze off in 3 minutes. So they have a high fat contribution or percentage of fats per that 1 calorie at rest. They're easily sleeping. They're at a resting metabolic rate. Now you say, that's what I want you to do. I want you to go out and I want to run a marathon. When you get out the marathon, I'm going to put you back in the chair. I'm going to measure your resting rate because you're back in the resting chair. And you're going, well, I know, but I'm not resting. Oh, no, you are. Look, you're sitting in the chair. You're not doing anything. You're resting. So the mammal in you says, hey, I'm still recovering from that marathon. And so to your point is, the more fit you are, it may take you 2 weeks to come back, 1 week to come back, or 2 days to come back as you get in shape. And if you want to make one huge jump, it's one of the reasons before any surgery you do as you get in your 50s and 60s, you want to go in fit on an elective surgery because the recovery is going to be shorter because you were in better shape going in. So hip replacements, knee replacements. But it's the same thing. The mammal takes longer to adapt to a resting state because it's never been there. And that's that I would say in any lectures you give, you look at these 60-year-old, 70-year-old people who are going to do a surgery. It's the surgery and the recovery is the biggest thing. So go in fit. A heart attack, you have no choice. You just go in.
Right.
You go, hey, can you wait for a while? It's like, but yeah, that recovery is also part of the mammal. And again, at the end of the day, we're all just mammals. We cognitively think we're talented athletes, but
yeah, and there's also in terms of burning is happening after you're done, right? Through the repair cycle and recovery cycle. Just because the heart rate isn't running high anymore, you're still burning. Which
and
is
so
why,
in that case, we would say the guy is now burning 2 calories a minute at rest and not 1. And you go, yeah, because he's still actually. And you'll notice this when you do intervals, for example. If you do a hard minute, and then a recovery minute, after you do 10 of those in a row, your ventilation is still on that last minute going, I haven't recovered yet. And you go, look at your heart rate is, or vice versa. Your heart rate will still be high, but your breathing will be down, and you have to recover both of those. So yeah, the mammal is actually quite interesting when it comes to cardiovascular endurance. I think you were mentioning that one of your relatives was a veterinarian.
Right.
So if you look at the racehorse, it's always interesting to me. So heart size to the mammal size and lung size is interesting. Is the mammal's kind of designed poorly compared to the racehorse, with the bigger hearts. So if you look at these horses, and it's kind of a sly thing that's done, but you'll see a lot of blood come out of the nostrils of these racehorses when they're finished. It's because their lung volume is forced so hard to exhale, because their heart it pushes them more than the humans do. You never see a human start bleeding out of their nose. So you go, boy, I guess we're designed to not run like a racehorse, but we're not supposed. So the mammal is unique in a lot of representations. But the other thing, and I'll make sure I throw this in because I don't want to waste anybody's time, but don't get hung up on having a peak VO2 that's high. Because if you look at the track and field athletes, there's a reason that, literally 2,000 plus years ago, they had 100 meters, a 200 meters, a 400 meters, and 800 meters were events. And people didn't double in each one. They said, well, if you can run the 4, you can easily run the 800 meters. You could double and set world records in both. And you go, no, I can set the world record in the 4, but I can't set it in the 8.
Right. And
so again, if you make the analogy simpler, is if you had 2 identical twins who both like to run, and you said, okay, choose a event for you to run. One guy says, I want to run the 400. One guy says, I want to run the marathon. And you follow them 18 years later. And now the one identical twin who chose the marathon has the world record in the marathon. And the guy who was doing the 1500 never even made the team. And you go, you're probably not really good at that. So the higher peak VO2s will travel with that person who has to have it. And you see it in cyclists and cross-country runners, because climbing those hills is a brutal thing to do. You have to have a high VO2 as far as high muscle endurance, which the track athletes don't. So you only see peak VO2s high in the fast 10Ks and the marathoners. You don't see it in the 400-meter runners. Doesn't mean they're not world record meter. Doesn't mean they're not fabulous athletes. So their retest is not to see, can they get a peak being like Le Mans 90? No, they'd be happy to get one at 50, but they're not ever going to run the marathon. That's their DNA.
Yeah, and let's kind of move it from that into why VO2 matters with aging, in terms of what's the value of making sure we have a reasonable, or certainly, when I teach, just for context, I teach all of my students that the 90th percentile is the goal we want to aspire to. We don't need longevity genetics to be there, but we can train virtually everything to get you to 90 percentile. And, luck will play its cards no matter what. But in terms of, because you touched on it there, was around really on the strength piece. Mm-hmm. And so we think about, if you're 50 today and you're going to be 60, or wherever you are every decade going forward, of where that really starts to pay dividends for you in later years, when you're not worried so much about trying to set world records or personal bests anymore.
The adaptation for that is going to be with the measured VO2 is still going to be at the mitochondria, because being inactive, you're not going to turn that mitochondria over. But the easiest one to explain is, and we do the firefighters, for example, if you did, and let's make the math so it's somewhat easy, and I'll try to see if I can come up with numbers. Say you have a resting rate of 80 beats per minute when you get on the treadmill. Let's make it 70 because you could be artifact, but 70, and you can go to 170 as your max heart rate. And every minute, you need 10 beats. So when I increase the rate, you go, I need more blood, I need more oxygen, here's 10 more beats. So 100 beats from 70 to 170 means he's going to give you 10 minutes of each minute's going to steal 10 from him. And he's going to get to 170, he's going to stop.
Right.
With training, he doesn't come in at 70. He comes in at 50. So now he has 120. So he can.
Okay, hang on a second. I know the answer, but you skipped over it for those who don't. So he comes in at 50. Why 50 instead of 70 anymore? That's an important piece.
Because the stroke volume, so all the mammal cares about is how much blood leaves the heart. The easiest analogy for this, and I say it, although I know it's clinically incorrect, but people get it. So again, and let's make them identical twins. Two identical twins are in the ocean. They're in the identical boat, and both boats have a hole in them. And the water's coming in, and they got to pump the water, they got to throw the water out, or they're going to drown. But they're the same identical twins. So they're the same strength, the same everything, the same weight. The one guy looks over and he throws out once a minute. And then he sits there for 59 seconds. And his other brother, the identical twins, going 1, 2, and I'm going, wait a minute. What's going on over there? How come you're only doing 1 and I got to do 2? And he goes, well, I got a bigger bucket. I got a gallon bucket, you got a half-gallon bucket. So all the boat needs is you need to get a gallon of water out. Now, in your case, the rest is the one guy's at 70 because he doesn't eject the same amount of blood. The guy at 50 ejects more blood. So they both get the same amount. One guy gets to save his beats so that when he starts walking, he has more possible beats. He can go longer without fatigue. And that's the training effect you have to have with these inactive people. Now, in a clinical setting, if you flip it, they'll call it an ejection fraction, not a stroke volume. So even they will have a left ventricle, but their heart is so weak, it can't even eject the blood. So it has to beat much faster. So in other words, they have a higher rest because they have a low ejection fraction. And now we would call it a stroke volume as athletes. But all that gets down to, you need to save your beats, because when you run out of chips at the poker table, you don't get to play any next. You're done playing. You got no more chips to play. So you want to delay. So when the guy comes back in and he's fit, instead of using 10 beats a minute, he now only has to spend 7. So when he gets to the 10-minute mark, he goes, hey, I got more chips left. Let's go another minute on this treadmill. And you go,
right?
Why'd you run out of chips? Well, I had a low stroke volume. So the training effect for the aging is everything. Your heart rate will always be linear because your cardiac output is linear. Choose the smallest beat or the biggest bucket. In other words, get the most blood out per beat, which is the training effect of being active. Sedentary, and you'll know this, when you get back out of shape, your resting heart rate goes back up again because that vagal tone of your nerve says, dude, you're back to a small bucket. And that's why being inactive is the worst thing you can do with cardiac patients, and the worst thing you can do with sedentary, because that vagal tone only says, I'm resting back at 90. And so again, if you get these guys who are at 90 and they only get to 120, they get 30 beats. So the reason they can't walk very far is they only have 30 beats to give you.
Yeah.
Boy, when you were a kid, you had 150 to give me. Yeah, well, I got out of shape. And so that's where VO2 is very important, because you can look at what changed in the athlete.
Well, and to maybe the other way to look at it too is we all think of like bodybuilding. When you do exercise, you see muscle definition, muscle growth more specifically, but it's the exact same thing happening on the heart muscle. The muscle fiber is different, but you're building a stronger muscle muscle structure around the heart, right?
Yeah.
So it's able to, I use the grip in terms of how much am I going to squeeze out, the stress ball, I can squeeze that tighter with a fit heart.
And that's, again, goes back to if you go and people say his ejection fraction is in the 20s, you're going, that poor guy's he can't pump the blood pressure cuff up to get the blood to come out.
Yeah, because the chamber never empties. It's just a question of how much do you get out of that chamber with each, because it's all timed. There's only a certain amount of time. It doesn't wait until not like I'm squeezing like as long, until I can't do it anymore. No, it's timed. It's got to have whatever the opportunity is, right?
Sorry, I interrupted, but it goes back to the same thing. If the boat has to have a gallon go out every minute, it doesn't care how fast or how size your bucket. It says, give me a gallon. And you go, I can't do this anymore. Sorry. That's not the answer. You're going to drown.
Yeah. So there's a good lead into what we routinely see with people who do a VO2 max test, who have a hard time actually achieving what's their capacity of VO2 max, right?
Right.
So maybe you can talk about what.
Well,
now you're going to see the difference between stress or between performance athletes and Joe Public who walks in to do a test.
Yeah,
I assume very different. Yes. Or Greg, for example.
Yeah, a lot of that is why I've never been a fan. So again, the protocol, the treadmill protocol that's been around, called Bruce, named after the doc who invented it, is a 3-minute stage at 1.7 miles an hour at 10% grade. So literally, if you walk 1.7 miles an hour, you're going to get run over, even at a slow mall. That's really slow. And so when they choose these protocols, and for example, if I flip it over and use it on a unfit guy on a bike, if you use 50 watts every minute, he can do the first minute, but the next jump is at 100. So he can't even get there because the jump is too high.
Right.
So the protocol makes him stop, even though he could go higher. And you go, well, his heart rate was low. Why'd he stop? And you go, he doesn't have the leg strength to do it. So protocol selection is one. And then the other thing that's unfortunate is, and I use this analogy a lot, and I think I may have used it with you, is when I went to grad school in 1980, I was in Minneapolis, and I drove to Dallas with my 1977 Cutlass. And, trust me, I had a cassette player, and the window went down, and I had sunburn on my arm from hanging out the window because we had air conditioning. You know how that was back in the... But I got my engine all tuned up. So again, my car engine would be blind, in this case, my heart. I tuned the engine up. I was doing it because I said, I got to drive. And they're not going to take a check in Oklahoma from me. I mean, you could write a check back in the 70s and 80s. You could walk any place and you write a check without ID, right? So I said, okay. I figured out how many miles it was, what kind of gas mileage I got. So my engine's fabulous. But I stayed from Minneapolis, I get to Iowa, and my gas tank is on empty. Now I'm going, what happened to, 19 miles a gallon? I mean, this thing, I should be able to get to Nebraska, but my engine was out. So again, this is the guy before physiology of understanding the effect of work on weight and its effect on work is, I pull into Dallas, and the mistake I would have made, and I say publicly, is I pull in the gas station, I'm so mad, I go, you got to fix my engine. You got to recalibrate that engine. That engine is just terrible shape. It's getting 9 miles a gallon. It was getting 19 in Minneapolis. And he goes, well, for $200, I can retune that engine up. But if we just unhook the U-Haul, you're going to go right back to 19. And the reality is, when you go in, if you're 220 and the last treadmill you did was 180, go put the 40 pounds on you and go back and do the 180 and put a 40-pound weight on him and say, that excess weight is not helping you move. So one of the things that I think when it comes to the elderly, which is why the longevity with VO2, excess weight affects your mobility in the short term on your heart, long term on your knees, hips, and ankles. But when they fatigue, you got to ask, how much work are they really doing now compared to what they were doing before, or how much are they doing compared to the person next to them, who is, in your case, 60 kilos, and they're at 100 kilos, doing the same amount of work. The speed is the same, but they're just not able to do it. So body weight is a big deal with your mobility, and it's unfortunate. If you look at aging, medical screens, you just have to remain as mobile as you can. And anytime you want to walk outside with a 40-pound weight vest on, you go, I think I'll just take the weight vest off today. And so that's one of the things I look at with the test. Couldn't be a protocol, but if you're, or in that case, try to do a bike test. But a lot of times you're just asking yourself to do way too much on the bench press that you can't possibly lift.
Right. And so to kind of flip it around to say the benefit of maintaining a high VO2, and I don't mean like performance level, but in terms of, and we'll call it excellent, which is, I think that there's elite at the very top. Is that like the top?
Yeah, I think there's a bell-shaped curve
or something. But
there's a bell-shaped curve for the normal people. Then there's a flat line that goes way out, and then there's another bell-shaped curve that goes out with the studs. But yes, go ahead.
But anyway, so it's really around if you want to continue to do all the things you enjoy doing today, which most people say, I want to keep doing what I'm doing for as long as I can.
Right.
Well, in order to do that, you need to maintain some level of VO2 that associates with what you're asking your body to do.
Yeah, and again, if you think of VO2, all it means is the mammal in you needs to be able to consume oxygen so that it can continue to be ambulatory. So if you go, well, we're mammals, so we have to inhale oxygen, we burn fat or carbohydrates. Low VO2s mean you have the low ability to consume oxygen, which means you have poor cardiac output, poor mitochondria, poor red blood cells, and you're going, well, that's not what you want as a mammal. That's just
right.
So the VO2 simply means you don't consume oxygen anymore. You're going
right, and you probably don't have the strength to be able to produce the demand either, right? They kind of go hand in hand.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah, the atrophy follows right in line. Another thing I found really interesting in my kind of study on VO2 is the mortality rates of athletes versus non-athletes. So there's kind of went back to what you talked about earlier, where people bank too much on fitness, think that that'll take care of everything. The reality is some other stuff will have its play, but maybe you can talk a little bit about the difference of what happens to a fit person's heart. So where I'm going with this is angiogenesis in terms of how does that play? That to me is kind of one of the interesting thing that happens inside. You don't have any idea of what's going on, but maybe we can talk about that a little bit.
Well, I wish, and this is I'm going to step. I'm not trying to dodge the question. But what I think the year 2050 will know that answer much better.
Yeah.
And the reason I say that is we've never had as many. So the boomers are the best guinea pigs to say who died and who didn't, who kept alive, who could we keep alive, and who had a quality of life. And being kept alive is possible if you just have no movement because you're just going to sit in a wheelchair and look out the window of the nursing home for the last 7-8 years of your life. So the question is, if you tie it to mortality, medicine is always trying to keep people alive. That doesn't mean you're going to be able to have quality of life. I mean, go to the nursing home now. I mean, I always said if VO2 is such a great predictor of mortality, then boy, there's a lot of people in the nursing home that are in a wheelchair and haven't walked a step in the last 5 years. And you go, well, how come they're not dead? And you go, well, because we got them on enough medication and oxygen to keep them alive. So we figured out how to keep them alive, which is a great thing. Insulin was a great example. Insulin was phenomenal. I mean, the grandparents who are type 1 diabetics now are only because of insulin. So you have to look at mobility. What I'll answer that question more so about, I'll take a bigger approach on it. If you don't have a purpose that wants you to get up and be active, you're going to go downhill very fast. So once you lose your physical mobility, the rest of that goes down quicker. Your cognitive, your mood states will go down. How you deal with loss will go down. So in the longevity space, eventually everyone's heart will stop because we all have one. So the reason that most people die of heart disease is because their heart stops. But so you ask a difficult question for me to go too far down, where I would tell most people, find a purpose in your life that keeps you cognitively alert, emotionally stable, and hopefully it's tied to some physical movement. And this may be I don't think I've ever shared this before, but sorry, without reading glasses on, I can't see as good as you are. So I had this guy that wanted to. I mean, this was at our house back in Minneapolis. He came in and he was a tradesman. I guess it's not that big of a deal, but the story is powerful. For me, it was. So it was one of and he said, "Hey, do you think you could get me to run sub 4 for a marathon?" And I was like, an odd question. I mean, very specific. And he was a lean guy, and he saw a bunch of stuff around the house, and he said, "Looks like you do a lot of stuff with athletes, or whatever." And I said, "Well, I've been, just part of the life." And I said, "Well, why would you want to run sub 4 for a marathon? I mean, where'd that come from?" And he said, "Well, I was a smoker for years." And he said, "My daughter came to me and said, Dad, you got to quit smoking. Got to quit smoking." And he said, everyone else said, and I said, "No, I don't need to." And for some reason, she got to me. It made me enough to say, "I'm going to quit smoking." And she said, "In fact, you and I are going to go run the community, mile. We're not going to run the 5K. We're going to run the mile together. And we're going to do it." And it was fascinating because, so this is the real life story coming out. The guy was just, couldn't have made it up. And I said, "How'd you do?" And he goes, "Oh gosh, she came over to the house. We couldn't go around the block. I was coughing so bad. Bad and coughing so bad." And I said, how'd you, she was right there. "Come on, Dad. Come on, Dad." So right next to her, he got her through, they got through the mile, and he was like, "We did it. I can't believe it, man. I quit. I haven't had a cigarette since, what? I feel like I'm back." And he said, so then they did the 5K. And again, she's in charge of signing him up, get him to do it. And he goes, I go, "So, your daughter just like saved your life, man." And he goes, "Yeah, we started doing 5Ks. And then, he said we did a 10K. And, so I kind of beat her in the 10K. I had to kind of slow down." And he goes, "So we thought, okay, let's try a marathon." And he said, "So we did a marathon, but man, I was just always slowing down so she could keep up alongside of me." Again, he didn't understand that he just had a higher cardiac output than she did because she was a male. He didn't get it. And he said, "So, but we finished," and it was like, but all my buddies say, a 4-hour cutoff is like real men. Real men do a 4-hour cutoff. And I'm going, just a thought. You do realize that your daughter saved your life. You realize your daughter is the one who saved your life. And now when you line up at the marathon, you leave her mile 1 and you never run alongside her. The whole thing of you having fun. Why don't you, for the next 20 years, go to the American Lung Cancer 10K run and find 20 states and go there with her and run the 10K with American Cancer for Lung, saying you stop smoking, and that's why you and your daughter have joy. And your fitness level will keep you fit to run a 10K and do it in every state."
Yeah.
Of course, he looked at me like, "Why? I got to run sub 4 so I can be a stud." And I'm going, "You missed the whole thing on longevity."
Yeah.
And so when someone asked me, you asked a very specific question, and it was very deep, but in the big picture, it's the guy saying, "How do I run sub 4? Don't. Go for the next 20 years of your daughter. Go to a new state. Go run a 10K. Help other people quit smoking. Help them be active. Now you'll find more joy and more purpose in your life with it."
Yeah, it's funny. I got a much shorter version of a similar story that I shared with my wife on our run literally this morning. And we were talking about races, and
Right.
She's a strong supporter, saying I should do one a year, just find one a year. And I'm having a hard time finding one that's interesting and appealing to me. And so I happened to mention, I did Richmond last year, and it was good, had a good race. I said, but it's kind of overcrowded, and
Right.
They're packing a few too many in. And then I remember, I did Ottawa 2 or 3 years ago, and I did that to pace my son, who was doing his first half marathon.
Right.
And I'd never put the two together, but I said, actually, now that I think of it, that race was really jammed as well. But I was so busy focused on him the whole time.
Right.
I wasn't paying any attention to all the other stuff around, versus when I did Richmond, I was on my own. I was just kind of, doing that inventory of how's your body doing
Right.
relative to everything else. Yeah. And it's one of the great things which we see around sport and fitness where it can bring people together. And I tell people, like, go to one of these big events just to see what happens. It's a different experience to be amid all that energy, all that positive energy. Everybody's pulling for everybody. There's
And,
no
you know, and that,
no competition like we think about beating people typically.
to your point, we did that with breast cancer, the Race for a Cure. Jimmy Smith's wife, a buddy of mine, went to grad school with phenomenal, intelligent exercise phys guy. His wife, Francie LaRue Smith, was asked me to do the Race for the Cure. This was back in the 80s in Minneapolis. It was a breast cancer run. They did the pink shoes for the Race for the Cure. And, they went from, I think the first one was on Mother's Day. And I said, Francie, in Minneapolis on Mother's Day, that's not the day most women are going to get out of bed at 7 o'clock to go run a 5K. I mean, they like to kind of get, have people make breakfast, and plus it could be snowing. I mean, seriously, it's not the day to run a 5K.
Yeah.
And of course, that was the guy in me couldn't figure it out. And again, this is what you learn as you get older, is that your mobility should be tied to something that gives you a purpose and a quality of life. And if you can't consume oxygen, you can't do that. But they end up having 30,000 people go to around the outdoor big mall for the Race for the Cure. But I was surprised at the number of people who were there to support people who died compared to people who didn't. So again, it gets back to this. The joy was the ability to do that event, successfully finish it, wasn't to win it. And that's what kept them motivated. So with you and your son, I mean, pretty soon he's going to go, hey, Dad, you got to pick the pace up a little bit, or we're going to have to, but I say that with a lot with the older people, is that going for a walk with your grandkids outside is the joy you find. Staying in shape allows you to find that joy. So if you can't consume oxygen, and that means your heart can't beat, your mitochondria doesn't work, you can't deliver it, you can't metabolize fat, you don't have any joy in the last 20 years of your life. So again, the test should allow you yearly to say, my heart rate is higher than it was last year. I'm burning more carbohydrates. I've got to figure out how to stay active. I got to find something new. And because the joy I got by finishing that is what I'm training for. It's not to have a high peak VO2. So again, that kind of probably went way off of most people's topic, but there's a lot of really good data on why we measure it and how valuable it is to do breath by breath now, and protocols, and with the athletes, they get paid a lot of money to perform. But at the end of the day, the majority of people are still mammals who, if they can't consume oxygen, again, mammals have warm-blooded, we got to maintain 98.6, we consume oxygen. If you can't have a VO2 of oxygen consumption that's free and efficient, your mobility will go downhill fast.
And maybe one way to think about it is why now, right? So that element of the benefit of building it up through your adult years means you're starting with much more, I'll call it, in the reserve tank.
Exactly.
So kind of like you said around the heart rate, you've got more bandwidth to work with than if you keep putting it off, right? You're not going to be able to get as much later.
Yeah, and I think that data is actually, if we look, which I think 2050 will be a great thing, because you can look at a large population, the same population for a lot longer. That 220 minus your age for a max heart rate was just a bogus throw-out line. And so now we will see the 60, 70-year-old person who's been active all their life will have not 220 minus 70, it'll be like 220 minus 50. So they'll be able to have a higher max heart rate because they've kept it active across the aging. So if you've been inactive for 20 years, you wasted a lot of training effect, and the mammal will still try to react to it. But again, you can look at that for what it was, but the tragedy of living a long time was when people say, I should have done this, or I wish I would have done that, and taking care of their health. Again, we're the first generation that structured exercise is valuable because we've all created the remote control. The reality is we're very sedentary, automated. But my great grandfather, I took him the first time I took him to one of the clubs, or my grandfather, he's a farmer. He he could not imagine somebody being on a treadmill. He thought that was the dumbest thing in the world. I go, Grandpa, well, what's that guy doing? I go, he's on a treadmill. He goes, what's he going? I go, like, he's running on a treadmill. He goes, but he ain't going nowhere. True statement. I go, well, Gramps, seriously, what do you mean? It took me a while to figure out. To him, going for a walk meant he had to go get the cows in the morning.
Yeah.
And that generation
it had a purpose. Everything had a purpose.
To him, it's like the cheetah. The cheetah's not just going to run wild to see if he can go catch something. It only knows, I got to eat. I'm going to chase that one. I'm not going to chase them all. But for him, I read about in the first book, I said, it's funny. I always wondered if my grandfather would have got all done farming from 6 o'clock in the morning to 7 o'clock at night and said, I got to go to the barn and get on the treadmill so I can stay in shape. And I said, the good news is they didn't have a heart rate strap and they didn't have electricity in the barn. So neither one of those scenarios ever played out. But I think for you and I, you're going to see as the boomer gets into 2030, 2045, you'll see who they'll still be alive, but who chose the mammal to stay active and who chose the mammal to be sedentary inside them, whether they liked it or not. They thought the joy was staying in shape. Well, the joy is finding who you're going to have a purpose with. But once you can't consume oxygen, which means the mitochondria have become inactive, the densities drop because you're not challenging them. Your cardiac output is back to just beats only. There's no stroke volume. You're just going to become more and more lethargic. And I think the sad thing, I had this conversation yesterday, that the diagnosis of depression is not clinically, it's more lifestyle driven. So there are certainly people who have depression in their DNA. But if you have no mobility and no function, and you say, well, I can see why he's depressed. There's no quality of life in him. That's a side effect that can be changed if you change the scenario, the lifestyle. So I think by the end of the day, the mammal in you will continue to fight. But the worst thing to do is to go lay down there. And if you think of it with this use it or lose it, I think the more clinical way to look at that is that the mammal reacts to stressors. So in other words, if I start to walk, my heart rate goes up. When I get done walking, the reaction is I will learn to recover, as you say, replenish, or and repair. So once you remove the stress, you also remove the biological reaction that is what you want. So you no longer repair anything, you just let it atrophy. You no longer replenish anything. And so by removing that action, the beneficiary reaction phase of the mammal says, I don't need to replenish anything, don't need to repair anything. And so that's cognitively, that's the same as emotionally, and yet you stay alive. So it really gets down to, again, if you look at oxygen consumption scores, you're just defining the mammal as needing to consume oxygen to do something. And then as you get older, you're going to find more valuable in maintaining a high level of VO2 because it allows you a high level of mobility, I guess is the way to look at it. But those three things, the mitochondria, the stroke volume, and then that score of efficiency is the one you want. So put a mask on as opposed to their watch.
Yeah, and I guess the other part of this too, to remind people, is it's kind of the two sides of the coin, is which I think just a different way of saying what you were just speaking to, is the body will adapt to whatever you ask it to.
Right.
At virtually every age.
Yes.
Right. And so if you don't ask it to adapt to being active and doing things you like to do, it will adapt to what you're asking it, which is to be sedentary. We don't have sedentary people following in this channel, but it's again, more from the reinforcement, right?
And so, if you look at also I always wondered, I was with Greg and we were doing a few talks after his retirement, and I always thought I was sort of intelligent, and I say that very cautiously. Not that I was smart, but I've been exposed to a lot of things. So here's Greg, and we're speaking, and he gets a question in French, Italian, Spanish, and English by just instantly, and he talks back to him in each of the languages. And I'm looking at him going, I wish I would have learned a second language when I was a kid. I mean, I can learn it now, but my ability to act and react is like, how much harder is it to learn to speak French when you're 70 compared to if you were 15? And he learned it out of necessity. But I look at it and I go, boy, that action reaction thing, the longer you wait, the harder it is for you to learn a second language or to play a musical instrument. And those are the things that action reaction inside the mammal is the adaptation that is the great training effect. If you become sedentary, there's no reaction phase. That means there's no adaptation. You don't learn anything.
Well, and as I watch older athletes, I'm just constantly reminded, and it kind of goes back to what I was going at with the one of the typical shortfalls in the VO2 lab test is that people underestimate their abilities or their capacities.
Right.
And the few who kind of are willing to push the envelope kind of get some surprises. It takes more than one event to do it, but that was what I was going at. Like the lab test, a lot of people quit because they're not used to the discomfort, right? You and I talked, or you told me about kind of Greg's, maybe share the story about kind of putting Greg on a VO2 Max, because I think that's important for people to hear what that's like, because it's not something that many of you even experienced.
Again, he was a person that's, think about it, Jesse Owens winner. They don't give those Jesse Owens awards out to very many people in the globe. But when we would do his peak stuff, and we bring him back every 2 weeks to look at his mitochondria, it was just he and I in a room. So people think, oh, you go to the NBA game and the cheering and all the noise and all the dancers and all the music's out there, and there's a whole vibe that goes on. So he would come in, he goes, turn the music off. And I'd have some, basically elevator music on. And he goes, I don't need that. And it's like, you see the other players are all out with headsets on, listening to music when they warm up. And so we would do these 5-minute max retests. And he'd just look at me and I'd count down like 3, 2, 1, and that's when we'd start. He'd have a warm up, then it was just, we'd put him at a power output and he had to survive. And all it was survival. It just was survival. So, but he would go somewhere. I have no idea where he went, but he wasn't in the room. I mean, he's all I hear is these lungs just forcing air out like a parachute. And then he got done at that 5-minute mark. He'd just blink and he'd go, how'd they do? I'm going, where do you go? Where do you go? Because everyone else is going, you got 2 minutes left. You got 2 minutes left. Come on. That was bizarre. And so these guys who have that are phenomenal. Now, we did another group of Team Trek professional mountain bike riders who came in with him. And we had a guy that said, and this is to your point about understanding tolerance to fatigue, or not having a role model that helps you, pushes you like that. This guy said he would do these, we would do these 5-minute max intervals. And then we do a recovery and then 5 minutes again. And then again, we look at peak VO2 that way. And he said, I do 10 of these. And I'm going, I don't think you do 10. I don't think.
10 5-minute max.
Yeah, I don't think you do 10. And it was like, let's, I'm happy that you do these. And again, he was an Olympian.
Yeah.
So put him on and put him on this workload. And he got to, but again, the power in the data was why I knew it was wrong. So his VO2 oxygen consumption score was going up, linear with work, as he tries to catch it. So he's an oxygen debt trying to catch the workload, trying to make it to the time limit. But at the 3.5-minute mark, compared to what I would always do with Greg's everything was just redlining, just like Ford versus Ferrari. If you ever watched that movie, phenomenal movie. Greg's were like this until everything just got to the top and then he stopped. But this guy's at 3.5 minutes, it started to level off, which means he's actually steady stating. It's no longer a climbing. So he's like, instead of climbing up the hill, he then went to here and just rode at a plateau. And I said, yeah, that's phenomenal. That was great effort. And he was at 191, 192, got into 190s, and his VO2 was legit. But again, these guys.
What, sorry, what 190 heart rate?
And again, so again, that's not unusual for these guys. So I said, do me a favor, I want to redo that test. And he goes, so you do 10 of those? He goes, yeah, I can do 10 of those. I go, yeah, I know you can do 10 of those. So I said, clearly it was, he didn't know it. But I brought him back because we rotated the 8 guys through. And I said, let's do that again. And he was fine. And he was by far one of the most fit guys of the team. So I bumped the workload up just a fraction, maybe 5% power output. And said, okay, same thing. He goes, got it, nailed this thing. He was all excited. Everything is the same because you can tell when they're driven. That first 3.5 minutes is where he was struggled, but he was waiting for that 3.5 minute where he said, okay, I got to the top. Now I just got to survive for a minute and a half. Right. And he never got there because at 4 minutes, he's still climbing. And you could tell he's looking at me like, and he was really furious. But he had also premised the fact that he was going to do the 5 minutes because he did 10 of it. And he took the mask off at that 5 minute mark, just threw it. And he goes, what are you trying to? I go, and I said his name. I said, 198 beats 4 mLs per kg higher. And he goes, you serious? I go, yeah. Don't do those 10 like that. Do 5 like this.
Yeah.
And again, here's a guy, which is the downside of being fit, is if you're the fittest guy, you don't push yourself until another guy comes in and says, okay. Right. And that's why with Greg, to be able to do it in the lab with nobody around, still remarkable. I still go, he didn't have 10 guys racing where your adrenaline is pushing you. So, but again, I think the joy, the comparison is the elite athlete finds joy in winning. And the joy of winning surpasses all the pain in training. I think that the 60-year-old whose grandkid says, let's go climb this mountain or let's go do a 10K, and you do it with the kid and he's so happy. That's the joy that you'll find that makes the mammal in you stay healthy, because the grandkid is going to go, boy, the last 20 years, old grandpa, man, he just wasn't very fun to be around. I mean, so again, what he's saying is the mammal atrophied, and his ability to consume oxygen is the best way to look at that. So again, maybe those two will help you, but yeah, I mean, in my case, I'm just making sure that, which I think was the reason for the first book. And I appreciate you putting it in about playing the back nine or the 18th hole. Is you just want to be on that 18 with the friends that you have and enjoy it.
Yeah, no, that's actually, I think that's a nice wrap up to it, Dan. I hope people kind of get this as an inspiration to do more, right, or to realize at least do more than what you think you can do, or test to see if you can do more you can do, because you'll ride that wave a lot longer, right? That's the other way to kind of look at it. Catch a nice wave. Well, you got to get out, you got to swim out, you got to get the board, get out, and then enjoy the ride, because it's a lot nicer ride when you got some horsepower to lean on.
Yeah, again, I appreciate the time, but again, there are very few people that I find as passionate about you or as data-driven. But I think the biggest adaptation that I would say that I'm the most optimistic now is with there's something called photo biomodulation. They use red lights now that are deeper. So like if you look at cryotherapy as a way of repairing, or if you look at some of the stuff with lymph drainage, and again, you're trying to look at the athletes and how we can affect mitochondria function. We stimulate it, but we can overstimulate it and get fatigued. But with these red lights that they use on scars and things like that, there's a doc out of Minneapolis called Stefano Sinacropi, just a phenomenal guy, and started showing me about what they do with concussions for brains with red lights, because they can get through the skull.
And this is infrared red light therapy. Yeah.
And I was like, show me the data on that, because with Greg, with his mitochondria, when we end up 90 days, he came back, but that's a 90-day window of which you have to let that mitochondria regenerate itself. Just like with a concussion, you got to put these guys in a dark room with no stimulus until the brain comes back. So you're trying to figure out is there something we can stimulate? Like, again, you go back and say, we used to put ice on things. We used to do treatments, modalities to help repair or replenish. Again, you and I started drinking fluids in the 10K. Then we started using, some of the glucose drinks and some of the glucose polymers so they could get through the gut. All those are ways of replenishing that the mammal didn't have before, but now we do. But I think that not just a Red Bull, but there's some real signs on that. That's pretty amazing on the repairing of the mitochondria. That's unique. But again, let science help you, but don't rely on it. Because we can keep you alive by putting an oxygen tank under your nose and you can walk around that. But again, for you and I, we both understand longevity is a gift. Don't waste it.
Absolutely.
Well, thanks again.
Thanks, Dan. Fun conversation as always. And we didn't get too far into the music world. We'll have to say that for another
Gee,
one.
ain't it funny how time slips away, Willie? All right, I'll let you go.
Okay. Thanks so much, Dan.
Bye.
Hope you enjoyed today's show. Great to have you part of our over 10,000 strong WellSpan community. Remember to subscribe if you'd like to learn about our upcoming shows. And as always, make sure you provide some feedback, whether that's a thumbs up or a comment, a question. They're all welcome. If you'd like to subscribe to our quarterly newsletter, you can do that at wealthspan.com. We're always looking for show ideas, or maybe you think you'd like to be a guest. Again, please reach out to book a motivational talk or inquire about our leadership workshops. Email me at info@wealthspan.com. Until next time, stay engaged, stay curious, take good care of you, those in your care.